I never thought strangers would call me a gold digger at my husband's funeral. Snow drifted softly outside St. Mark's Chapel, while black luxury cars lined the frozen street, and guests whispered beneath crystal chandeliers about the man they all claimed to admire. I stood alone near the back pew wearing the same black wool coat I had owned for nearly 10 years, because grief made appearances feel meaningless to me now. My husband Edward Whitmore rested quietly beneath white roses at the front of the chapel, while his children greeted investors, politicians, and business partners like they were hosting a corporate event instead of mourning their father. She got lucky marrying him, a woman whispered loudly enough for me to hear while adjusting her pearl earrings beside the aisle. Another voice answered with a quiet laugh. Some women always know where money lives. My fingers tightened around my gloves, but I kept my eyes on Edward's casket because defending myself suddenly felt exhausting after 21 years of marriage spent proving I loved a man long before anyone knew how wealthy he would become. Rebecca Whitmore walked past me moments later in an elegant designer dress smelling faintly of expensive perfume and cold winter air. She glanced briefly at my coat before leaning toward one of her friends. "My father deserved someone more refined beside him today," she murmured softly. The words landed harder than I expected. Across the chapel, Attorney Charles Bennett stood near the stained glass windows holding a thin leather folder against his chest while watching the entire room carefully. Unlike everyone else, his expression carried no judgment at all, only concern. Then, as the funeral service began, he slowly walked toward me and quietly whispered something that made my heartbeat stop for a second. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said calmly, "there are details about Edward's estate that nobody in this room knows yet." The funeral reception moved into the grand ballroom beside the chapel, where servers carried silver trays of champagne beneath glowing chandeliers, and soft piano music drifted through conversations already shifting away from grief and toward Edward Whitmore's fortune. I stood quietly near the tall windows watching snow cover the city streets while Rebecca laughed beside a group of investors wearing the confident smile of someone who believed the future already belonged to her. "Father always promised the company would stay in the family," she announced proudly while swirling wine inside her glass. Andrew Whitmore nodded beside her, adjusting the cuff of his expensive black suit. "Everything is already practically settled," he added calmly. Hearing them discuss inheritance before Edward had even been buried made my chest ache in ways I could not explain. Charles Bennett approached slowly, holding the same leather folder against his chest. "You should prepare yourself for tomorrow," he whispered carefully. Before I could answer, Rebecca suddenly appeared beside us with a polished smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Charles," she interrupted, "I hope there will not be unnecessary confusion during the estate meeting." Her eyes shifted toward me for only a second. "Some people become emotional when money is involved." I felt several nearby guests glance toward me immediately, pretending not to listen. Charles remained calm. "Your father was very clear about his wishes." Rebecca laughed softly. "I am sure he was." Then she leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough for only me to hear. "Nobody forgets why young waitresses marry rich, older men." My stomach tightened instantly because Rebecca never knew the truth about how Edward and I met decades ago inside a struggling diner long before Whitmore Capital became worth billions. I opened my mouth to respond, but Charles spoke first. "Miss Whitmore," he said firmly, "you may want to be very careful about what assumptions you make before tomorrow morning." Rebecca's smile disappeared immediately. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" she asked coldly. Charles looked directly at me before giving a quiet answer that stopped the room around us from feeling warm anymore. It means your father left far more behind than money. The ballroom grew quieter after Charles spoke because even the investors standing near the champagne table sensed something shifting beneath the polished surface of the evening. Rebecca crossed her arms tightly while staring at him. "You are being dramatic," she said coldly. "Father already explained how the estate would work." Charles did not move. "Your father explained very little to anyone before he passed." Andrew stepped closer beside his sister, looking irritated now. "Then maybe this conversation should happen privately tomorrow instead of in front of guests." I stayed silent, watching snow slide slowly down the ballroom windows while memories of Edward sitting beside me in hospital rooms flashed painfully through my mind. During his final weeks, he barely trusted anyone except Charles and me. Rebecca suddenly looked toward me with visible frustration. "You always act innocent," she snapped quietly. "But somehow you ended up living in penthouses and vacation homes after marrying my father." Several nearby guests stopped speaking completely. I could feel their attention settle over us like cold rain. My voice stayed calm when I finally answered. "Your father and I lived in a one-bedroom apartment for almost 6 years before Whitmore Capital made its first million." Rebecca laughed once without humor. "That sounds convenient now." Charles opened the leather folder slightly before removing several sealed documents. "Actually," he interrupted firmly, "there are financial records proving Mrs. Whitmore personally supported Edward during the company's earliest years." Andrew frowned immediately. "What records?" Charles looked directly at both of them. "Records your father specifically ordered me to reveal only after the funeral." Rebecca's confident expression cracked for the first time all evening. Then before anyone could say another word, one of Edward's senior executives suddenly approached our group, looking pale and unsettled. "Mr. Bennett," he whispered urgently, "the board members just received copies of a confidential ownership document from Edward's private office." Charles slowly closed the folder again. "Then I suppose," he answered quietly, "the surprise arrived earlier than expected." The atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted completely after the executive mentioned the ownership documents because suddenly nobody cared about champagne or polite condolences anymore. Groups of investors gathered near the marble columns whispering urgently, while several board members checked their phones with visible confusion. Rebecca grabbed Charles by the arm before he could walk away. "What ownership documents?" she demanded sharply. Charles gently removed her hand without losing composure. "Documents your father authorized for release after his passing." Andrew looked directly at me now instead of through me for the first time all evening. "Did you know about this?" he asked quietly. I held his stare for a moment before answering honestly. "Edward told me there were protections in place." Rebecca laughed bitterly. "Protections for who?" "The widow everyone already knows manipulated him." The insult landed hard enough that even nearby guests looked uncomfortable now. Still, I stayed calm because grief had already exhausted every part of me capable of fighting publicly. Outside the ballroom windows, snow covered the city in soft white silence, while inside, Edward's family slowly unraveled in front of strangers. Charles finally opened the leather folder fully and removed a single page. "For 21 years, Mrs. Whitmore remained silent about her financial involvement in Whitmore Capital because your father insisted her privacy be respected." Rebecca folded her arms tightly. "What involvement?" Charles placed the document onto the marble table between us. The original startup investment. Andrew leaned forward, reading the numbers before his face visibly lost color. "This cannot be real," he whispered. I watched both of them carefully while memories flooded back of late nights balancing unpaid bills beside Edward inside our tiny apartment before success ever arrived. Rebecca suddenly looked up from the paper directly at me. "You funded the company?" she asked softly. Before I could answer, Charles delivered another quiet sentence that changed everything again. "Mrs. Whitmore did not simply fund Whitmore Capital," he said calmly. "Without her family trust, your father would have lost the company completely in 1998. Silence spread across the ballroom after Charles revealed the truth about the original investment, because suddenly every person who spent the evening judging me looked completely different standing beneath the chandeliers now. Rebecca stared at the financial documents with trembling fingers while Andrew slowly removed his glasses like he could no longer trust what he was reading. "Mother gave him the startup money?" Andrew whispered in disbelief. Charles corrected him immediately. "Mrs. Whitmore did far more than that." My chest tightened as old memories returned all at once. Edward sitting beside me at our tiny kitchen table in 1998 with unpaid invoices scattered everywhere. His hands shaking. His voice breaking as he admitted Whitmore Capital would collapse within weeks without help. I never cared about luxury then. I cared about him. Charles removed another sealed document from the folder while several executives quietly gathered closer around us. "After the financial rescue," he continued calmly, "Mrs. Whitmore became majority shareholder under a confidential legal structure designed by Edward himself." Rebecca looked up so fast her chair nearly hit the marble floor. "Majority shareholder?" she repeated weakly. Charles nodded once. 53% ownership. The room exploded into stunned whispers. I watched the shock spread through the ballroom while snow drifted softly outside the tall windows, because for 21 years people assumed I entered Edward's life chasing wealth when the truth was painfully opposite. My money saved the empire they all admired. Rebecca's voice cracked for the first time. "Then why did father always let everyone believe the company belonged entirely to him?" I lowered my eyes briefly before answering quietly. "Because he promised me privacy mattered more than recognition." Several board members exchanged nervous looks immediately, because suddenly they realized the woman standing quietly near the windows controlled not only Edward's fortune, but the future of Whitmore Capital itself. Then Charles delivered the final blow. "Under Edward Whitmore's signed estate agreement," he announced clearly, "Mrs. Whitmore has inherited the entire fortune, including all executive voting authority, effective immediately." The ballroom erupted into chaos after Charles announced the inheritance, because suddenly the same people who ignored me all evening began staring like they were seeing a completely different woman standing beside the windows. Rebecca stepped backward, shaking her head slowly, while Andrew looked frozen beside the marble table, unable to process what he had just heard. "Entire fortune?" Rebecca repeated weakly. "That is not possible." Charles remained perfectly calm. "It is already legally finalized." Several board members immediately moved toward me, offering nervous smiles and quiet condolences that felt painfully different from the judgment they carried only an hour earlier. I noticed every single one of them. Rebecca suddenly slammed her champagne glass onto the table hard enough to silence the room again. "She manipulated him," she snapped loudly. "My father would never leave everything to someone outside the bloodline." Her words echoed sharply beneath the chandeliers while guests exchanged uncomfortable looks around us. Still, I refused to lose control because Edward hated public cruelty more than anything. Rebecca, I said quietly, your father made these decisions while fully healthy and legally advised. She stared at me with visible anger and humiliation burning across her face. You planned this for years. Andrew finally spoke again, but his voice sounded exhausted instead of angry now. Rebecca, stop. She ignored him completely. She wanted the money from the beginning. The accusation hurt less this time because now everyone in the room already knew the truth. Charles opened another document carefully. Actually, he interrupted firmly, Mrs. Whitmore signed multiple agreements limiting her personal withdrawals from the company for over 2 decades. Rebecca fell silent instantly. Several executives exchanged stunned glances again because suddenly the widow they mocked looked more responsible than anyone else standing there. Then one of the board members stepped forward, nervously clearing his throat. Mrs. Whitmore, he asked carefully, there is an emergency executive meeting scheduled tomorrow morning regarding leadership succession. I looked toward him calmly. And the man hesitated before answering. The board assumed Andrew would become chief executive officer. Snow drifted quietly outside while every eye in the ballroom turned toward me, waiting for the answer that could change Whitmore Capital forever. The ballroom became completely silent after the board member mentioned the chief executive officer position because everyone understood the future of Whitmore Capital no longer depended on assumptions or family expectations. It depended entirely on me. Rebecca folded her arms tightly beside the marble table while anger flashed across her face. Andrew has worked inside this company for 15 years, she argued immediately. There should not even be a discussion. Andrew stayed quiet this time, staring down at the ownership papers still spread across the table, as though he was finally seeing his father's life clearly for the first time. I watched him carefully before speaking. Leadership is not inherited the same way money is, I said calmly. Rebecca laughed bitterly. Easy for you to say now that you own everything. Charles stepped beside me again. Mrs. Whitmore also legally controls executive appointments under Edward's estate agreement. The room filled with whispers all over again. Rebecca turned toward me sharply. So what now? She demanded. You are going to sit in Edward's office pretending you built this company? Her words carried enough venom that several executives looked away uncomfortably. I held her stare without raising my voice. I helped build this company long before anyone here knew its name. Andrew finally looked up at me then, and for the first time all evening his expression no longer carried arrogance. Only confusion and regret. Why did Dad hide all of this from us? He asked quietly. My throat tightened because I already knew the answer. Because your father feared success would make people forget loyalty. Snow drifted heavily outside, while the ballroom lights reflected softly against the windows. Rebecca suddenly pushed her chair backward with visible frustration. This is unbelievable, she snapped. You turned everyone against us in a single night. I slowly reached for the estate documents resting on the table before answering with the calmest voice I had used all evening. No, Rebecca, I said quietly. Your father made his decision years ago. Then I looked directly toward the nervous board members standing near the ballroom entrance and made the choice that changed the entire future of Whitmore Capital forever. Tomorrow morning, I announced calmly, I will personally decide who deserves to lead Edward's company. The next morning, Whitmore Capital headquarters felt colder than usual beneath the gray winter sky as executives, lawyers, and board members filled the top-floor conference room waiting for my decision. News of the inheritance had already spread across financial media overnight, and now every person inside the building looked at me differently. The same assistants who barely acknowledged me at previous company events suddenly stood when I entered the room wearing my modest black coat. Rebecca arrived several minutes later with visible exhaustion beneath her makeup, while Andrew walked beside her silently carrying a folder filled with leadership proposals he no longer seemed confident presenting. Charles Bennett organized legal documents near the head of the polished conference table before speaking calmly. Mrs. Whitmore now controls all executive appointments effective immediately. Rebecca interrupted before he could continue. This entire company is reacting emotionally because of one funeral, she argued sharply. Edward built Whitmore Capital for his children. Charles looked directly at her. Edward built legal protections because he understood exactly how quickly grief reveals people's true character. The room fell silent again. I watched Rebecca carefully because for the first time since Edward died, her confidence had almost completely disappeared. Even the investors who once surrounded her now avoided standing too close. Andrew slowly pushed his proposal folder aside before looking toward me with tired eyes. I should have defended you yesterday, he admitted quietly. Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. Andrew. He shook his head slowly. She spent 21 years protecting this family while we treated her like an outsider. Hearing those words inside, Edward's company hurt almost as much as it healed. Snow drifted quietly outside the conference room windows while board members waited nervously for my final decision. Then Charles placed one final document directly in front of me and spoke 7 words that changed the atmosphere again. Edward left one personal instruction for today. The conference room remained completely silent after Charles placed Edward's final handwritten instruction in front of me, because everyone understood this was no longer only about money or corporate power. It was about the truth Edward wanted remembered after he was gone. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter while snow drifted quietly beyond the tall glass windows overlooking Manhattan. Edward's familiar handwriting immediately brought tears to my eyes. If Helen is reading this, the letter began, then the people around her have probably forgotten who carried this family before success arrived. Rebecca slowly lowered her eyes while Andrew stared silently at the polished conference table, unable to speak. I continued reading softly. My children inherited my name long ago. But Helen inherited my trust because she stayed beside me when there was nothing left worth staying for. The room felt painfully still after those words. Even the board members looked emotional now. I folded the letter carefully before looking toward Andrew first. Your father loved both of you deeply, I said quietly. But love does not erase responsibility. Andrew nodded slowly with tears forming in his eyes, while Rebecca remained frozen beside the windows, finally understanding how badly she had misjudged me from the very beginning. Then I made my decision. Andrew will become interim chief executive officer under board supervision, I announced calmly. Shock crossed several faces instantly. Andrew looked completely stunned. After everything, he whispered. I managed a small, tired smile. Your father believed people should be judged by what they learn after failure, not before it. Rebecca wiped quietly at her eyes while snow continued falling across the city Edward spent his life helping build. As the meeting finally ended and executives slowly filed out of the room, I realized something important about grief, wealth, and family. Money changes how people see you. But hardship reveals who truly sees you at all.